Hello and welcome back to CWU Live. Today we are talking politics with Chris Webb, MP. Not to be confused with Chris Webb, Head of Comms for the CWU. Chris is Labour MP for Blackpool South. A pleasure to have you on the show. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks for having me.
Also joined once again by Chloe Kaufman, Political Coordinator for the CWU. A pleasure to have you back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Let's begin. Actually, I'll begin by telling you what we're going to talk about. So today we are mainly going to be talking about politics, about what it means to have a representative of the CWU in the Commons. We're going to talk about an issue which has been brought up in the Commons this week, which I think is going to be close to the hearts of many viewers, which is letterboxes on the bottom of doors. Some really outrageous stories about how many people's fingers are getting sort of seriously injured by dog bites. So we're going to talk about that going through Parliament. We're also going to discuss the challenge of reform. Chris, you're in a constituency where you just told me actually Nigel Farage was visiting today.
He was, yeah.
So we're going to talk about what your strategy is, I suppose, for fending them off. I suppose let's begin though with you, Chris. You're a CWU member. You're also an MP. How do those two roles intersect, as it were?
Well, I'm the son of a postie, and my dad's role at the minute is regional secretary in the Northwest. So I've been involved with the CWU when it was UCWU and others since I can remember. So I was joining on campaigns. The main first political campaign I can remember was the Stand By Your Post campaign as a kid, going with my dad across the Northwest up to Morecambe, campaigning on behalf of postal workers and delivering leaflets. And so when I joined the Labour Party, I also became a trade union member because that's my background from the trade union movement. That's what, has been there for my family all the way back to my granddad. So for me, it was really important to be that trade unionist first. And it was the trade unions that founded the Labour Party. So for me, it's a perfect fit.
And then I suppose, what does it mean that sort of it's... I suppose you're just in communication with the CWU a fair amount, and so you might be asking questions in Parliament or putting forward sort of things that CWU members care about. Is that?
Yeah, so I mean, being a member and being active, I know a lot of the reps, I know a lot of the workers, and I see it day in, day out, and obviously discussions with friends, family, and others that are postal workers, BT engineers, working for Santander and others. So for me, when I see those issues, I can take them up on behalf of my constituents in Parliament, but also give my support to campaigns that the union does, and also support the CWHA charity as well as a trustee, and the work that they do and other members of the union do for the charity.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that. How have you sort of got involved in the CWU's humanitarian work?
So since it started 30 years ago, since my dad sent the first truck, I've been helping loading, fundraising, did the London Marathon for CWHA a few years back.
You did?
Yeah.
Oh,
so, and we've, I've gone from going on convoys, helping lead them, the last one to the border of Ukraine, where we took aid to one of the refugee centres in Poland, but also scrubbing out, cleaning the trucks, helping load. So every bit you can think of. But it's been a family affair. I've been involved. My sister's fundraised on some of the walks. My mum's helped with packing the shoeboxes to send off to some of the orphanages. So as well as my dad, helped set it up 30 years ago and is the chair and has been the integral part, it's been a family affair.
Yeah, that's really interesting, really impressive. I didn't know about the marathon.
Yeah, I've unfortunately done 2 marathons. I'm not built for marathons, but it was great. It's the first one. It was for my 30th for CWU, HA, and we raised money for the centre in Moldova, but also the school that we've got in Tanzania to help build a library there for the kids.
Oh, amazing. Chloe, as political coordinator at the union, and presumably you have a lot of interaction with MPs who are also CWU members. I suppose, how many of them are there, and how much of a difference does it make to you?
Yeah, so we've got a few CWU MPs in Parliament. We've obviously got Chris Webb. Some other members might know Lee Barron, who used to be our CWU Midlands Regional Secretary, who was elected at the last general election last year, affectionately known sometimes as the Union Baron. We've also got Tahir Ali, who used to be a postie up in Birmingham. But we've also got a wider group of not necessarily people who've come from being a postie or working in BT, but who are a group of supportive MPs who we work with all the time. So people like Ian Lavery, people like Kay Osborne, and people like Annalise Midgley, who we'll talk about a little bit later. And we work with them quite closely to make sure they're raising our issues in Parliament. They're trying to find ways to get a better deal, either for postal workers, BT workers, tech workers, and they're kind of really at the forefront of our political operation in Westminster.
You've mentioned Annalise Midgley there. Let's go to a clip of her raising an issue important to many CWU members.
I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to amend building regulations to require letterboxes in new buildings and front doors to be positioned in accordance with British Standard EN 13724/2013. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government says it wants to raise standards and focus on delivery. So I have got a perfect bill for them. It's the letterbox positioning bill. Last Christmas, I visited the Royal Mail delivery office in my constituency in Huyton. I watched our posties working flat out, and it really hit home how hard they work, whatever the weather, whatever the conditions. And I asked, what could I do to help? They said, sort out those low-level letterboxes. Because they're worried that one of these days, one of them could get a life-changing injury just doing their job. Like Lancaster postie Anthony Quinn, who lost the top of his finger after a dog lunged through a letterbox and bit him. He was just doing his job, delivering the post. Or like South London postie Andrew Burge, who was attacked through a letterbox by a dog that locked onto his hand and wouldn't let go. He suffered serious damage to his ring finger. He was just doing his job, delivering the post. Or like Wakefield postie Elaine White, who lost the top of her finger in another attack. The damage was so bad, the doctors could not reattach it. That's permanent, life-altering. She was just doing her job, delivering the post. During my visit to the delivery office, posties showed me scars and injuries from the dog attacks through letterboxes. And Madam Deputy Speaker, members across this House will have countless stories and first-hand experience of our campaigners getting dog bites, delivering leaflets to low level boxes.
That was Annalise Midgley. You could be seen sitting next to her in Parliament there. Can you talk about that intervention? So, I mean, that is a private member's bill, isn't it? I understand, no one seems to be particularly opposed to the idea, but sort of give us some context to that speech we saw there.
So it was a 10-minute real bill, so it was put forward. We've got, hopefully, second reading on the 11th of July. There was cross-party support. I don't think you're going to find any MP who's going to disagree with this, especially when they're out delivering their leaflets and their literature. But one thing we do have across the parties and the House is MPs going in to see their delivery offices every Christmas, especially. So they hear this. I've heard it when I've been visiting mine in Blackpool. So you won't really find any opposition. We've just got to find how we can get this through. So whether it is through a private member's bill or an amendment to some upcoming legislation. So that's what we're working hard now to look at.
And what would the policy be? It would be to ban floor level post boxes, but I suppose just for new builds or new doors. No one's going to have to replace their door.
Yeah, that's it. It'll be for new builds and for new doors that are made, bringing them to British standard, so that we're not forcing anyone. There's no financial burden at the minute, but it just then phases them in to make sure that it's easier for posties and all those that deliver post or literature through the front doors of constituents.
So I mean, it's probably also there's probably lots of people who got one of those low letterboxes without thinking about it, and now feel kind of a bit terrible. But because it's not something when you told me about it, I was like, oh my, that makes so much sense, and that's completely terrible. But you can see how it happened, where people didn't realise that would be as big a problem as it is. Chloe, I mean, it's called a 10-minute rule private members bill. Somewhat. What does that even mean? But I suppose the practical question is this going to become a law? Or is this the sort of
Just to explain, a 10-minute rule bill is a type of bill that backbench MPs can bring forward. So that's MPs who aren't government ministers, and you can also bring it forward in the House of Lords as well. And so they bring forward a bill to the House, and they can speak on it for 10 minutes, and then people can oppose it as well if they want to. As Chris mentioned, there wasn't really any opposition. In fact, there was quite a lot of enthusiasm. I was actually lucky enough to be in the chamber that day with some CWU colleagues and some posties as well, and you could clearly see there was widespread support for this. I will say it's unusual that 10-minute rule bills eventually become legislation because there's a very limited amount of time in the parliamentary schedule and government legislation is prioritised. But what it's really effective for doing is kind of being a starting platform for eventually getting this in legislation somehow, probably likely as an amendment to a further piece of legislation. So it's going to help raise awareness of the issue, but also help us continue our conversations with the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, who have the power to actually do this and actually enforce the ban.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting. I mean, yeah, definitely they should do. Is there a public information campaign as well, just to tell people don't get a letterbox at the bottom of your door?
I think we'd like to do that in the future. We're obviously campaigning a lot on social media at the moment to try and raise awareness of the issue. I think it's something that a lot of people don't think of a postal worker's job as being very dangerous, but actually if you don't have the correct safety measures, and we've seen this huge increase in dog attacks, particularly since the pandemic as well, and as low-level letterboxes have become more popular, that if you don't have these measures in place, it can actually be quite a dangerous job for people. And, you know, we've seen that with the statistics about how many of our members are getting attacked. So I do think that is really crucial, is getting the public to sort of understand that, but we're going to keep on pushing this in Parliament and hopefully as well in Scotland and Wales too. So we can.
And you were telling me earlier today that you've seen sort of a collection of pictures of postmen's and postpeople's delivery officers. Their injuries from dogs.
Yes, and
which we're not making public, by the way, but
no, but they're really harrowing. And I think, as you mentioned at the beginning of the segment, I think it's around 1,000 postal workers in the last 5 years who've had a finger either partially or completely bitten off through a letterbox. And we've also seen a really big increase, 148% increase in the amount of dog attacks that cause like serious and significant harm as well. So it's not just that we're seeing more attacks on postal workers, it's that they're getting more serious in nature as well. So it just goes to show how important it is to push this through and to make sure we get that ban, and that being a postie does not become a dangerous job, essentially.
Yeah. Let's talk about Labour more generally. Chris, how do you think they're doing? Well, how do you think you're doing, I suppose? No, but you're a backbench MP, so you're not a member of the government. Well, so how do you think the government is doing?
So I think what the government inherited was awful. I think there was a reason they went for an election early. They knew it was coming to an end. You just have to look at the prison places stats. I think it was less than 100 prison places left when we walked in on the first day. So there's a lot to do. It's going to be difficult. There isn't the money out there. You know, this isn't 97. We've not come in and the economy is as booming as it was. We're still feeling the effects of Liz Truss's mini budget. That's, you know, people are feeling that with mortgages and rents. We know with the energy spike as well, many people struggling to pay the bills. But we are seeing signs of things changing with growth. Wages have gone up more in the last 10 months than they have in 10 years. We're seeing energy bills coming down. We're seeing inflation coming down, some mortgage rates as well, with interest rates coming down. We've seen today more announcements of waiting lists in the NHS coming down. First time in 17 years that waiting lists were cut in April, which is normally the busiest time for the NHS. So there are signs. We're moving in the right direction, which is great, but there's still a lot to do.
And I suppose some unforced errors, perhaps. I suppose the winter fuel allowance issue, which has now U-turned on. They've sort of said it's because we've made the economy so much better that we can now U-turn on the policy we introduced last year. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think there was a few of us at the time that didn't support it. I didn't vote for it, but I'm glad they've listened. And they've now acted, and the majority of pensioners in my constituency, which does have a large elderly population, will now get that support. So, you know, they've listened and they've made that adjustment, which is great. But we know more and more with the economy improving, we can do more. And we've seen that with lifting 100,000 kids that are now eligible for free school meals. And that just lifts kids out of poverty, which is what we're in it to do. We did that in the last Labour government. We need to do it again.
Chloe, we get you on every now and again to talk about how the Labour government are doing. What's sort of your latest thoughts? I suppose I know you've worked a lot on the workers' rights bill, which I suppose we're just kind of waiting for now. Is it just because they've got too much on?
No, so it's currently sat in the House of Lords. So it's gone through the House of Commons and now it's, I think, at committee stage in the House of Lords. And so essentially, to give an overview of what that means, Labour has a big majority in the House of Commons, but the Tories have a large majority in the Lords. There's more Tory peers than there are Labour peers or crossbench peers. So right now there are a lot of Tory Lords who want to try and weaken the legislation by putting in amendments, particularly around trade union laws, and they're attacking sort of the relaxing of some of the trade union laws. They're attacking us, our political funds and our ability to campaign. And potentially what will happen is in something that's sometimes called ping pong, it will go back in between the Lords and the House of Commons. Though ultimately, because of the majority in the House of Commons, we do still expect this bill is going to pass and hopefully we'll get royal assent by the end of the year. But from the CWU perspective, we're working with our allies in the Lords to give them all the information that they need to combat all of the Tory lies about the bill and all of the lies about it being not good for the economy and all this type of rubbish that we know is not true, so that they can really defend this bill. And I think that's really important because they're sort of trying to have one last swipe at the New Deal, but we know ultimately that this is the right thing for working people, it's the right thing for our members, and we need to go even further as well. So this is just the beginning.
Duran Adatia says, any home with a dog should be required by law to have a postbox outside. This should be a must. James Brunn says, sort the pay deal out and we can fit letterbox cages. Now, we knew that there'd be lots of people wanting an update on those pay negotiations. Unfortunately, we're not able to give you one because those negotiations are still very much in play, and it wouldn't be appropriate for none of us are in a position to comment on that, basically. But obviously, updates will come in due course as and when those negotiations sort of make or come to a deal, basically. So this is just to apologise to say we're not going to be able to answer questions about that at the moment. So we're going to sort of stick to the more general political questions. But as soon as possible, you of course will get that update when it's ready. Let's talk about reform. Yeah. So you are in a seat where reform came second. Yeah. I mean, I presume if polling were to stay the same as it is today, you would be losing your seat to a reform candidate if there is not some kind of turnaround.
Not necessarily, no. So I got 48% of the vote, so bigger than the vote share that Labour got nationally. I think there's a factor of that was, local, I'm born and bred in my seat, first MP from the town to represent the town in a long time. So where some of my colleagues are obviously concerned with that polling, I'm not as concerned, if I'm honest, because I know the work we've done. I brought record funding to Blackpool in this last year. I got in before the general election, a few weeks before, on a by-election. But, they are now the opposition in Blackpool. The Conservatives have just crashed in Blackpool. They are not the opposition in my seat, but even Blackpool North and Fleetwood. So they're active. A lot of the Conservatives have moved over to reform. They've now got two councillors. One was defection from the Conservatives and Blackpool Council. So they have become, effectively the official opposition. But they're not delivering for Blackpool. People in Blackpool don't suffer fools lightly. And they've now, once they're scrutinised, they collapse under the pressure.
And I suppose let's talk about that in a bit more detail, because you've said you're not as worried as sort of the polls might suggest you should be, but I presume you're thinking a lot about how to sort of take on reform and argue that your constituents and actually trade unionists as well shouldn't be voting for reform. So sort of, can you talk about where you're coming from on that? How do you think Labour's doing, I suppose, in terms of making that argument that they're the real voice of working people?
Yeah, well, it's absolutely nonsense that the voice of working people, Reform voted against every one of the votes that came through for the New Deal for working people. So if they cared about working people, they'd be voting for that change and the measures that we're bringing forward. Locally, for me, it's about delivery. It's about speaking up for Blackpool. It's about delivering for new investment, new jobs, And we've seen that, Blackpool was mentioned more times in the spending review yesterday than any other area in the country. That's down to hard work, lobbying, managing to convince ministers from across government that Blackpool needs that support. And that's what I've been doing this last year. And that's what my constituents want. Nationally, we have to call them out. They've already announced, I think, £80 billion of unfunded spending cuts. If they want to be a serious player in British politics, they've got to show where that's coming from. But also, you see Nigel's been in Blackpool today at the Reform pub, but it's been exposed. This is a pub that's held Nazi events when they've had the punk festival. The owner, has held BNP, Nick Griffin and others in his former pub. This isn't a nice place to go. But it's surprising that Nigel has gone today after that has been exposed. But he's in Blackpool. Hopefully he could grab some fish and chips when he was there, help the local economy before he left. But, nationally, we have to expose them for their dodgy economics. And don't forget, after Liz Truss's budget, Nigel came out and said it was the best budget he'd seen in years. So that's his type of politics. And he wants an insurance-based National Health Service, which we've said will never happen under Labour. It will always be free at the point of use with this government.
Chloe, what's your take on that? I mean, Farage is making an effort. He turned up to Scunthorpe Steelworks, didn't he, and sort of called for the nationalisation of it, I think before Labour did. He's clearly trying to court British workers. What's your response? What's the union's response?
I mean, building on what Chris has just said, we need to look at Farage and Reform's record on these things. So we need to look at not just what they're saying, but what they've done. So as Chris said before, if Nigel Farage and Reform are on the side of working people, why did they vote against the Employment Rights Bill? If they're on the side of working people, why did the Reform Manifesto last year talk about making it easier to fire workers? And if Farage and Reform wants to nationalise the steelworks, why has Farage spent the last 30 years of his political career calling himself a Thatcherite and talking about privatising the NHS? The reality is that Nigel Farage, Richard Tice are privately educated, multi-millionaire city boys who want to cut taxes for the rich and pay for it by cutting benefits. That is what they stand for. That's what they've stood for their entire lives up until now, and they've realised that that's actually not what the voters want, so now they've changed their tune a little bit. And ultimately, they can say whatever they want, but as a trade union, we have to pay attention to what they've done and what their record is. They're not on the side of working people.
Just someone's had a comment, Steve Turner, saying the Tories do not have a majority in the House of Lords. So they have the largest number of seats.
Yes.
They have a plurality.
Yes.
So they have more seats than either Labour or the crossbench, but no one has a majority in the House of Lords.
Yes.
But you're right that the Lords is more conservative than anyone else.
Yes, they love to appoint peers to the House of Lords.
Oh yeah, because Boris Johnson always just sort of puts it, well, he can't anymore, but when he was in power, he'd put in anyone who'd ever worked in Downing Street for sort of 10 minutes or whatever would get put in there. I suppose, what are you hearing from your constituents? Again, you sound like you're confident in your constituency, but what are you hearing people tell you when you knock on their doors about how they feel about the Labour government, how they feel about the alternatives?
So they have high expectations and they are desperate for change. So again, just before I came here, I was in the Commons talking about the health announcements, and Blackpool has the worst health outcomes in the country because of what the previous government did. Our hospital was labelled inadequate. There's 350 million of cuts in the ICB. This is the legacy of the former government. People want change. They voted for change in my by-election, and it's got the third biggest swing since World War II, and then in the general. So we've got to deliver that, but they are impatient. We're in a world where people want change immediately. They're seeing that with America and the way Donald Trump tweets in the middle of the night. But we've got to knuckle down, roll up our sleeves and get that job done as quickly as possible. But turning it around, and the economy and the public services that we've inherited will take some time. But we need to make sure that people know what's happening, they're on the journey with us, they understand where we're going, and there is that vision. And I think, if I'm completely honest, there has been a lack of that story and vision or that understanding since the government came into play. And when I was speaking to constituents, I think I best described it as Labour government, it's the old Morecambe and Wise sketch, that they're playing all the right notes, just not necessarily in the right order, to get that over to the public as a vision. But we're doing some incredible things, as we said, with the Employment Rights Bill, with new housing. £30 billion for new housing was announced yesterday. We're getting the neighbourhood Bobby back on the beat. Everyone will have a named police officer pretty soon in their wards. We've said about the family doctor. We're looking at dentists. You know, the things that matter to people day in, day out. We're getting on with the job. We're putting those pledges in. It's just taking a bit of time. So we'll just ask people for the patience. I say it's not even been a year since Labour got into government yet.
I suppose, I know across the union, sort of response to Nigel Farage trying to sound more pro-union is to say, don't believe him, the guy's a con artist. Would another option to be to sort of try and play reform off against Labour, to sort of say, well, Nigel Farage is saying he might, not that he has said this, but if you got him to say he'd renationalise Royal Mail, for example, so if you say, well, Nigel Farage said he'll renationalise Royal Mail, that means you should do that, Labour. Do you know what I mean? Could you use him as a negotiating ploy with the government? I'm putting you on the spot here because I know you might not have authority to make that huge pivot in terms of union strategy, but I thought it was an interesting point of discussion.
It's creative for sure. I think, I think that maybe wouldn't necessarily work is because ultimately, I also do think, as Chris, you've just described there, Labour see through a lot of these pledges that they're attempting to make now. And even if Farage did turn around tomorrow and say that he wants to renationalise Royal Mail, we know that he's not serious because he has been a supporter of privatised utilities for his entire career. This is disingenuous. So we can't play someone whose entire, main political quality is being disingenuous off of someone else because we just know it's not going to work. This is about getting Labour to come back to the core of what it is supposed to be, which is the political wing of the trade union movement and the vehicle for transforming life for working class people in this country. That is the way forward to ultimately continued political success for Labour, but also for getting rid of the threat of far-right parties like Reform and people like Nigel Farage, is coming back to what we're supposed to be doing, is fixing the NHS, improving workers' rights, letting the trade unions organise across the public sector and the private sector. That's the direction we need to be going in. I don't think we're going to, play some political games and find our way out of this. I think that's probably the wrong approach to take.
I suppose playing games like that with Nigel Farage, it's a high possibility you'll get burnt at some point. I mean, what do you think, Chris?
Well,
I mean, I know what your answer is going to be, but elaborate on it.
Well, you can't really take anything serious. If you've not got a credible economic plan about how you'll fund your pledges, then you can say what you want, but you're not a serious contender for government. And we know he's tried to do some on the left, some on the right. Nigel is very good at playing up for TikTok and trying to get that reaction. But actually, you can see his attendance record in Parliament. He spends more time earning the money outside of Parliament than actually being a member of Parliament in there. So, yeah, that's something you take serious.
Do you think CWU members should sort of pay attention to what's going on in Parliament, or do you think that for everyone's quality of life, they'd be better to just sort of switch off and watch something more entertaining than the 6 o'clock news?
I think they should engage with the local MP. I think they should make sure the views are heard. That's what we're here for, to listen, to understand and to represent. So definitely get in touch with your local MP about issues that matter to you. Ask for those surgery meetings, go to their events, lobby hard. Definitely, that's what we're here for. That is our job, is to listen to our constituents. So get involved. I'm not saying tuning in to Parliament TV at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday night. You'd probably better things on the telly. PMQs is always a fun one. But yeah.
It's relative, isn't it? PMQs. Wow. The fun one relative to 9 p.m. on a Tuesday night.
Yeah. But what I would say is engage with your local politician of all parties.
Yeah.
Because that's what they're there for. That's what they're to represent. Whether you voted for them or not, they have to represent you, whether they got your vote or not. So definitely engage that way.
And CWU members, what's your position? Should they be paying attention to what's going on in Parliament, or do you think better off and switch off and watch something more entertaining?
I think we all need to switch off at sometimes. It can feel very overwhelming trying to follow everything that's going on. But one thing I will say, though, the most successful campaigns that we've had as the CWU is the ones where we've engaged both our members and the public. So sometimes we'll send out like template letters for our members to email their MPs. And again, like Chris said, this is across the political spectrum. And those are the ones that are really, really effective when they can see that their constituents are really concerned about this. And again, from our perspective, we're unique as a union in the CWU because particularly when it comes to Royal Mail, we're spread all across the country. We're in London, we're in the Shetland Islands, we're everywhere. So every MP has to address the issues facing, in particular, our postal worker members. So we can build some really powerful campaigns off the back of that. And the low-level letterbox campaign is something that we definitely will send out a call out to, maybe a template letter to write to your MP, because as we mentioned before, lots of Conservatives support this bill. Lots of MPs, Lib Dems from all across the House do support this. So we do want our members to engage when the time comes for those really important campaigns, but you don't necessarily need to be an expert on everything or be watching Parliament TV at 9 p.m. to be doing
Apart from
that.
when Chris Webb is speaking.
Of course, yes.
When are you next speaking? How does it work?
Hopefully on the police and crime bill on Wednesday.
What are you going to say?
Well, effectively, we've lost officers, so we're not at 2010 levels yet of police officers in Lancashire. We got decimated under the Tories. This is about getting those neighbourhood bobbies. Also, additional funding for places like Blackpool, that is 21 million visitors that come every year. We're not just an area with a population. My constituency is 74,000. 21 million people come through it on top of that. So we do need that extra resource. So that's what I'll be speaking about and demanding for from the Home Office.
Brilliant. Chris Webb, Chloe Kaufman, thank you so much for joining me. Really interesting chat. Really good to meet you.
Yeah.
Great to have you on the show. Lovely to have you back, Chloe. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back the same time next week. Until then, stick with your union.